Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Big Houses and African Villages, the Plantation Melting Pot, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Teaching American History Project of Osceola County Schools and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. Now, you folks from Osceola are familiar with the center. I don't need to go into any introductions about that. Let me just remind you that we are now promoting all of our resources for teachers under the name America in Class from the National Humanities Center. And if you want to find out what those resources are and get access to them, just type into any browser America in Class from the National Humanities Center, and that will take you to this page. I just want to point out that little icon I framed in red. If you click on that, that will take you to this page. And if you haven't already ordered one of our free posters, please do so now. They're wonderful classroom decorations, and also they're carefully annotated so that you can use them as teaching tools. They picture that image that you see there in the corner of your screen, picturing Monopoly. It's the reproduction of a political cartoon, The Curse of California, that appeared in a publication called The WA back in 1882. And if you teach monopolistic business practices in the late 19th and early 20th century, that's a great teaching tool for you. They're free. Just request one. We'll be happy to send it to you. Now, let me remind you that tonight, after the seminar, there will be a recording of the seminar available on the Big Houses and African Villages website, the website from which you obtained all of your readings. There you will find the PowerPoint, and you'll also find the evaluation. Now, feel free to use the PowerPoint in your classes, and please complete that evaluation, send it to us. And once you do, we will send you documentation of participation so that you will be able to get whatever recertification credit this program warrants you to receive. Let me just remind you how this works for those of you who are new. We communicate through chat, and the way to do that is to put your cursor in the little box that I have framed in green there. Type your message. You see that send button to the right. Click on that, and the chat message will appear in the larger box above the send box. I will be following the chat all evening, and I will bring it into the conversation at appropriate moments. So please, if you have questions or comments, let us know that way. If there are there any questions before we get underway? Everybody ready to go? If you're ready to go, send me one of those smiley faces there, that little yellow icon, so that I know we're all on the right page. There we go. I see some coming in. Great. Okay, so let's get underway then this evening, learning about life on an antebellum plantation. We have two goals this evening. As always, our first goal is to provide you with fresh primary resources and instructional approaches for use with your students. We're also tonight striving to achieve an intellectual goal, and that is our essential understanding. Let me just put that out there on the table for us. From its very beginning, slavery in America was characterized by conflict and negotiation between enslaved people and owners. Through these interactions, Africans, African Americans, and Europeans also could not help but influence one another in essentially every realm of life, from the economic to the social to the cultural to the spiritual. We speak of syncretism in looking at these interactions, a process in which people from different backgrounds exchange and appropriate each other's practices. In this session, we will consider the exchanges through examples taken from labor, religion, and language, but we could also consider it through foodways, architecture, and a host of other practices. So tonight we're going to look at the way slave life influenced larger society of its time. We had a pretty good discussion of the topic on the forum. People posed a series of questions. What was the daily life of the enslaved like? How did American slave communities reflect the global nature of the slave trade? How did the enslaved adjust and adapt to plantations, cities, and factories? Was the melting pot experience different for the enslaved who lived in cities? What lasting impact has slavery had on the African American community? Are there regions of the United States that still show lasting impacts more than others? I don't know if we'll be able to address all of those questions tonight, but we're certainly going to take them into consideration, and we will try our best to address each one. To help us do that, we are very pleased to have with us Heather Williams, an Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a National Humanities Center Fellow in 2007-8. Heather studies African Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries with emphasis on the American South. She wrote Self-Taught, African American Education and Slavery in Freedom, which won the Lillian Smith Book Prize in 2005. So let me turn the program over to Heather. Okay, Heather, it is all yours.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Richard. Hello, everybody. I want to start, I should start moving slides. So the first slide I have here depicts a plantation home in South Carolina and a slave cabin in South Carolina. So both on plantations, but one occupied by owners, one occupied by enslaved people. And I've chosen these images because I think when we talk about a melting pot, I want us to always keep in mind that this was not, slavery was, there was no sort of unchallenged, loving, lovely melting pot with an exchange of cultures. That throughout slavery, almost everything was contested. The power dynamics were such, of course, that you have domination, you have resistance, you have owners who wielded almost unchallenged power in many ways, certainly legally, and people who were to be subordinated and were subordinated. So in the when Richard read that slide about negotiated relationships, historian Ira Berlin has argued that slavery was a negotiated relationship. And I think that when you really look closely at it, you can see points of negotiation. But negotiation does not mean businessmen sitting down at a table or business people sitting down at a table, starting from sort of equal positions. The power dynamic was very much skewed in this time period. And so I think these images help to depict that, because you have a home that is, I've been in many homes like this in South Carolina specifically. I teach a class during Maymester when I take students to South Carolina. And it's a course on slavery in South Carolina so that we can see the homes of the planters, and we can also see the cabins in which enslaved people worked. And of course, the people doing that labor helped to create the wealth that would build these homes. And so I think that this slide gives a good juxtaposition. Is there a problem with sound?
Some folks are having a problem, but don't worry about it. Karen
is
taking care of it.
Okay, all right. I just happened to glance down. So as background, I wanted to talk a little bit about how people got here in the first place and putting slavery into place. This slide talks a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade that took place starting in the 1400s. So with the Portuguese getting to Africa first, they had these ships called caravels, the ship that Christopher Columbus would later sail. Two of the ships that came to America were caravels, and they enabled the Portuguese and then the Spanish to go, not just to go down the coast to Africa, but to also get back to Europe. And so you get this technology that enables exploration, and one of the things that they decide is that they're going to capture people. They, I think, initially did not go looking for people. They went looking for gold and looking for a route to China, where they wanted also to find gold that they could then use to trade with China, because China wasn't really very interested in trading with Europeans at that point. But they see people and they decide to capture them. They take them back to Portugal, and I won't spend a lot of time on that. But eventually the Atlantic slave trade spread beyond Portugal. So Portugal is going to Latin America, to Brazil, for instance. And first they took people back to Portugal, captives to Portugal, and the elites in Portugal got slaves, and then they expanded it. And everybody in Europe was looking for a cash crop. When they went to this quote-unquote new world of the Americas, they're looking for cash crops, and then they're looking for labor to produce the crops. And in some places they used Indians. That usually did not work out. So Africans became the people who would produce this labor. People generally were captured in the interior regions of West and Central Africa, often, usually captured by other Africans. There had been slavery in West and Central Africa, taking a very different form than we have seen, than we would see develop in America, but slavery nonetheless. With the arrival of Europeans and this new market being generated for people, then you see a lot more captivity of people, selling people into slavery, to go on these ships across the Atlantic. People were marched from the inner parts of places that are now the country of Ghana, for instance, or Senegal, to Gorée Island on the coast of Senegal, or Elmina on the coast of Ghana, held, some of you may have been to these places, held in these dungeons, also called castles. So you have these spaces in which people were held, locked up, tied down, dark, dingy dungeons, and then above that you would have quarters in which the officials of the trading companies would live, or perhaps captains of the ships. And then often at Cape Coast, at Elmina, there's also a church right on the premises. So people were packed into these dungeons, and then when they had gathered enough to make the trip worthwhile, they would pack them onto the ships to take that journey that's now been called the Middle Passage. And we estimate that about 12.5 million Africans left Africa as part of this slave trade that went from the 1400s to, in America, the Atlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808. England abolished it in 1807. The Spanish didn't abolish it for some time, until some time later. And of course, in America, there still was an illegal Atlantic slave trade. Most people, and I give you these figures because the point of it is that North America received, so that would be, received about 4% of the people who had been captured in Africa. So most went to South America and to the Caribbean. And in those places, especially in the Caribbean, people were often just worked to death. And since there was a steady supply of captives, they would just be worked to death and were not reproducing themselves as enslaved people did in America after probably early in the 1700s. Just to point out, we often think about the English in these colonies of America. So now we've come across the Atlantic, we're in America, but I just wanted to point out that in Florida, you had a Spanish colony, and it remained Spanish for a long time. Then you get 1600, and that began in the 1500s. Then you have the Jamestown colony settled by the English, 1607. Shortly after the English settled in Jamestown, I mean, we're talking less than a dozen years, or a dozen years, there's a record of 20 Africans arriving in Jamestown, but a few had shown up earlier in censuses of the colony. But this is where we get some documentation of 17 men, 3 women being sold from a Dutch ship that we think had captured another ship, and that these people were from Angola, so West Central Africa. You also had the Dutch in the New Amsterdam colony that became New York once the English took over. So you've got different European groups coming to America, and all of them participating in slavery at some point.
Heather, let me just clarify something. Now, the 17 men and 3 women who arrived in Jamestown in 1619, and the 11 Africans who arrived in New York in 1626, were they slaves? Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, well, I want to say that they, this next line says they occupied different degrees of unfreeness, is kind of the clumsy word that we've used. So that in Jamestown, for instance, people were slavery did not resemble the slavery that developed. And you can see, I mean, we could do a whole other seminar on looking at the laws and the practices that were putting slavery into place and that were determining who would be a slave, how you became a slave, determining, for instance, that if you're passing a law in Virginia that the other colonies all adopted, that if your mother was a slave when you were born, then you would be a slave, so that you would not, your status would not follow the status of your father, who, for instance, might be your owner, a white owner, and you would be born free, but instead you would follow the status of the mother. So you can see slavery being put into place. So at first, we think that some of the people in Virginia, for instance, were similar to indentured servants. And then you can see in 1640 that is beginning to change. And so I'll just give you a quick example. 3 indentured servants ran away from their master, and the person who was in charge of indentured servants was also called a master. So they had been serving for a particular specified time. They ran away. 2 of them were white from Europe, not England, and one of them was African. And when they were captured in Maryland, sent back, they went to court, and the 2 white men were given time added, some years added to their service. So let's say they started out with 7 years, they'd worked 4, they had 3 years left, and the judge added a few more years to their service. The black man instead was sentenced to life as a slave. And eventually you start to see in Virginia that the courts they say, and the laws say, we cannot punish these Negroes, is the language, by adding time to their to their term, because they had already been serving as slaves. So by 1660, slavery was in place. In New York, in Dutch New Amsterdam, the 11 were brought in as captives. They were slaves. They eventually negotiated this position of half freedom, so that they were all men. The first 11 were all men. Women were brought in, African women were brought in to be their mates and to also work in the colony. And these men negotiated so that they and their wives would have this status of half freedom, so that they still belonged to the company. They were company slaves owned by the Dutch West India Company. But they could work on their own. They could keep whatever money they made. But if the company needed them to come in and build a road or to defend against Indians, for instance, then they could be called up into service in a way that other free people would not have been as vulnerable. So in those first years, you see some degree of freeness, but soon slavery was put into place.
Okay, and we have a comment in the chat. Some blacks in Jamestown own land. Is there any record of that?
Yes, there's someone, for instance, called Johnson, Anthony Johnson, who owned land, and he also, we know of him because there's a court record where he sued a white neighbor who, so Johnson had a servant who ran away, and this white man gave him refuge for whatever reason. And Johnson sued, saying, he is my slave, I own him, and he must be returned to me. And the court did, in fact, return the man to him. So we do, and that's how we know that in those very early years, there was more flexibility, that black people were not all automatically slaves, or they could work their way out of service. They were not bound to service for life, as chattel slavery would come to be.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then?
Okay. So here I start, because we're talking about contact and we're talking about interactions, and so I wanted to start with Equiano. And let me just say that I've given here just a little bit from Equiano's narrative, and then later I'll also give a little from Frederick Douglass. And these are widely available. Frederick Douglass wrote 3 different narratives or autobiographies, and you can get the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass online for $1. But also, there's a site at UNC called Documenting the American South, and it's free, and it's got full text of over 100 slave narratives. But more than that, full text of diaries by white women, journals, etc., by white men and women. So it's about the South, and there's lots of free material on there that and it's easily accessible, full text. So here I wanted to talk about Equiano, and there are other people who had similar experience. We don't get much documentation of these first contacts with Europeans. But some of the points here, Equiano is talking about his first encounters with whites and being captured as a child, passed from hand to hand. He and his sister were captured together, but eventually separated. He was sold into slavery within Africa several times, and then eventually made his way to the coast. And so here he's talking about his fear of when he first encountered whites, that I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. And so his language tells us something about his own spiritual beliefs and practices that he was aware of, but also tells us about his perception of these people. He notes difference, their complexions, too differing so much from ours, their long hair, the language they spoke. And so this idea of difference and fear and not knowing what's going to happen. You know, students often ask why, kind of about the slave trade and why do people keep selling other people? And part of it is greed. Part of it is they had no idea of what was on the other side, because these people who went to America did not come back to tell them about it. People don't go back until into the 1800s, really, when you have this colonization movement that's going to move people back. But many of them had never even been to Africa. They're born in America. So he's talking about a belief. He tells us that he believes in spirits, bad spirits, right? And he looks around the ship and he saw a large furnace or copper boiling and a multitude of black people of every description chained together. I no longer doubted my fate and became quite overpowered with horror and anguish, and he fainted. And the fate that he thought he was facing at this point was that people were going to cook them and eat them. And it's always interesting because I think often we hear about Europeans talking about others, Africans, Indians, etc., as being barbaric or as being cannibals. And here we have somebody from the other side saying, this was my fear. What were they going to do to me? And he turns to some black people who are taking cash. So there again, you see, these are the people who had taken him to the ship. They're accepting their pay, and he turns to them and says, are we going to be eaten by these white men? So, and then the following slides, and I won't spend a lot of time on them, talk about his encounters, not just with the people, but with the material that they had that he was not familiar with. And he's pointing out a clock, thinking that he's being observed, thinking that they have magical powers, that these white people who have captured, who are now holding him captive, have these magical powers, and they have these things around the ship that can spy on him and will report back. And so lots of anxiety, lots of fear, just not knowing what's going on. Yes.
Why don't we just stop here and ask if there are any questions about the Equiano narrative. I know a number of people have used it in their classes. Seems that students really enjoy it. Are there any questions that you'd like to pose here about the Equiano narrative? Again, let me remind you that these slides will be available on the seminar website, and we offer you those excerpts and the discussion questions so that you can use those in your classes with your students. Okay, well, I guess there are no questions. Why don't we move on then, Heather? We've got about an hour or so to go. Oh, here we go. I have a question. Someone once told me there were questions about whether he wrote the whole story. So that's some question about the contemporary scholarship on Equiano.
Right. So there's a book that came out about 5, 6 years ago, and I'm not going to remember the professor's name. He's an English professor.
Vincent Coretta.
Coretta, right, thank you. And he found a document that said Equiano was baptized in South Carolina, I believe. Equiano says he was born in Africa, captured in Africa. He was in America for a while, and then he went to England, and he was eventually, he worked on ships, basically, as a slave. And then he was freed in England. And so Coretta has raised questions about whether his narrative is accurate. And it seems that he took some descriptions of landscape from books on travel that had probably taken them from other books on travel. My assessment is, and I've turned to the people who study Africa, people who do the Atlantic slave trade, who are specialists in Africa and the Atlantic slave trade, and they seem to continue to use Equiano and to believe that this one document that Coretta has found does not prove that his story is not accurate. So that's where I think the field kind of lies at this point.
This is a little sidebar here. Vincent Coretta was a fellow of the Humanities Center many years ago, and he'll be doing an online seminar on Olaudah Equiano next fall. So stay tuned.
All right, so the next issue we're taking up is labor. And I'm going to talk specifically about rice cultivation and how that came about in South Carolina. But I wanted to just do a little bit of background again to broaden it so that we're not just coming into rice, but talking more broadly. So, of course, slavery, I think, we think about slavery and we think about, well, I shouldn't say we, I, for instance, have written a book on education during slavery. I've just finished a book on family separation during slavery. There are all kinds of aspects of slavery, but underlying it all was labor. That there wouldn't have been any slavery by definition if it had not been a matter of getting forced on free labor. So all of the European countries that settled in America, that sent people out to settle, were looking for some kind of cash crop. You have some people who came for religious purposes, but even they ended up in Massachusetts, for instance, having slaves. But let's say in New York, in Dutch New Amsterdam, in Virginia, when you've got these companies that are paying, who have claimed the land, the king has given them this land, and they're sending people over to generate wealth. It's an enterprise that's based on getting wealth. And so they're looking for cash crops that will be saleable to bring that money, income, wealth. And in Virginia, the first cash crop was tobacco. Indians had grown tobacco, but John Rolfe brought a strand of tobacco in 1617. And for most of the century, most of the 17th century, tobacco was primarily raised by white indentured servants. It's not until after Bacon's rebellion towards the end of the century, 1676, and nothing happens immediately, but Bacon's rebellion, when some enslaved people, but mostly white indentured servants, staged a rebellion and wanted to overthrow the government of the colony. And that's when you see a much more dependence develop on black enslaved labor. But for the most part, it was white indentured servants coming from England and other parts of Europe raising tobacco. In South Carolina was settled in the 1670s, And it's an interesting colony because in Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, Dutch New Amsterdam, later New York, you can see slavery being put into place. And you see it in flux, and then you see it being locked into place by law, interpretation of the law, practice, etc. South Carolina was something different because those planters came from Barbados, which already had slaves. It was an English colony. So their fathers essentially had gone from England to Barbados. When the small island starts to run out of land, they've been raising, the crop there has been sugarcane primarily. Many of the sons migrated to South Carolina, taking their slaves with them. So South Carolina was settled by people who already had an idea of slavery in place. And furthermore, the other colonies, Virginia, for instance, a successful, very successful colony, had already put it into place. So it came full blown. They, in South Carolina, tried cattle. They raised cattle. So you have these black men out with the cattle grazing, because some of them had experience from parts of Africa. They raised indigo, which is a plant that was used for dye, a blue dye. And then eventually they got to rice, and we'll talk more about rice. Georgia, you have rice and cotton. Louisiana, sugarcane, and then cotton by the after the invention of the cotton gin, etc. By the mid 1800s, cotton is king. So people are still growing tobacco. They're still growing other products, rice, but cotton. As the United States expanded, the big crop was cotton. So in terms of rice, it's a very interesting development, and I'll just summarize the development and then just go slowly through some of the documents. Again, South Carolina planters or settlers trying to find a cash crop, not coming up with one. Some of them tried to plant rice. Rice would come in. So on this slide, somebody's talking about Madagascar, but rice coming in from different places. They're trying to grow it, and this slide tells us they couldn't figure out how to do it. They couldn't figure out how to clean it. It was not something that they had been used to doing. But then eventually, I'll just say, eventually they found that some of the Africans whom they owned had some experience with planting and growing rice. And I think part of how this happened, Peter Wood, who was a professor, he's retired from Duke History Department, has written a book called Black Majority. And he really, if you want more details on this, he really does a thorough job of tracing this history of rice, and other people have written books on it as well. In South Carolina, one of the things that the planters brought with them and the enslaved people brought with them was this idea of a task system. So you have these different systems of labor. In North Carolina, in Virginia, you had a gang system in which people working in tobacco, for instance, would work at the sound, they would start working at the sound of the bell before dawn. They'd be in the fields, and then they would work all day under the sight of an overseer. So somebody else set the pace for them. They were expected to work all day and to just keep working for as long as the overseer or the owner said to work. That's the gang system. On the task system, which you see in parts of the Caribbean, like Jamaica, for instance, Barbados, each person was given a particular task for the day. And that's a place where you see this idea of negotiation coming in, because sometimes an owner, James Henry Hammond, for instance, who was governor of South Carolina, senator from South Carolina, had a huge plantation, married into wealth, and got this huge plantation with hundreds of slaves. And when he got there, he thought he would change the system, and the enslaved people said no. and wouldn't work. And so you see this thing that Ira Berlin would call a negotiation going on. So they worked out these systems so that if you were a man, let's say they would call him a prime man, a prime hand of, let's say, 25 to 30 years old, you would be expected to weed a certain acreage or flood a certain acreage, whatever was happening during that particular part of the season. If you were a woman of the same age, you might be expected to do something slightly less than that, probably not a whole lot less. If you were a child, something different, a teenager, something different. If you had some kind of a physical ailment or disability, maybe something less than that. And so they had this task system, and basically if you got your task done, then you were done for the day. And part of the trade-off was that then you were given a plot of land. And so let's say each family or each adult was given a plot of land that you were expected to cultivate to provide most of your own food. So under the gang system, you're working in the fields all day, and the owner then doles out rations at the end of the week. So much pork, so much corn, etc. Under the task system, you would have to provide your own food. And so we think that that's how this happened, that people started to plant rice on their ground, and it was they were successful. And so you can see in these first slides, we get descriptions of how difficult it was for the planters, the whites, to plant the crop. They didn't know how to do it. And then eventually, you see ships coming in bringing rice grains and also bringing enslaved people. And as I said, some of the enslaved people start to plant rice and it grows. And then you see, I'm skipping through some of this. Here's an example of a ship bringing in a cargo of rice and slaves. So this next slide tells a lot, and it helps to demonstrate what the process was. That once they figured out, once the planters and potential owners figured out that these Black people knew how to grow rice, they started, now there's a market for people from these regions. And so you see these ads, and there are many more like this, where people are being brought in and being advertised in Charleston as having come from, for instance, the Windward and Rice Coast. And they're talking here about quarantining them to make sure that they don't have diseases. And people were usually quarantined on Sullivan's Island right off the coast of Charleston. In the other ad, you see that they're bringing in, and they describe them, 94 prime healthy Negroes consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. And it's really important to note that rice cultivation on the rice coast of Africa, when we say the rice coast, we're talking about rice coast or sometimes called the grain coast, like areas that are now Liberia, Sierra Leone, up to Senegal, that women played a big role in rice production. There's a whole complex way, and I've heard it described many times. I've seen pictures, I've seen film of it, and I still, the technology still surpasses me. But you have to flood the fields, and so you have to dig these, they're more than trenches, and have water in them, and then there's a whole system of knowing when to release the water. So at a particular time of the year, you flood the fields, but you don't flood it too much, and then you have to flood it again, and then there's lots of weeding. The women would plant the rice with using the heel of their feet to make the hole, and then using their toes to press down the seed. And so they had a whole process worked out, and owners began to get wind of that, and then brought in thousands and thousands and thousands of people to work in rice. Peter Wood says, if these people hadn't had the skill, maybe slavery would have died out in South Carolina, or maybe rice wouldn't have been the cash crop. But this is what happened. And here you have an illustration of just women working in the field. And this is the mortar and pestle, because rice that we buy in the store, even brown rice that we buy in the store, has gone through a lot of processing. They've had to beat off the hull from the rice, because the way the grain grows on the plant, it's not edible. So you have to get access to the grain that we can then cook. And so this is a mortar and pestle, again, in use in parts of West Africa. Then the women would use these baskets. They call them fanner baskets. And if you go to South Carolina now, you can see where Gullah people still make the sweetgrass baskets that are now so expensive, none of us can afford them. But the big, wide, round ones, and the women would hold those and shake them in the air, and that would be to get the trash off the grain. So it was a whole process, and these people had that experience. Brought that here, and that became, I see somebody wrote Carolina Gold, right? It became the thing that made the colony of South Carolina wealthy. So that by the time of the Constitutional Convention, South Carolina is saying, look, we're not joining the Union. We're not going in if you're even talking about getting rid of slavery, because many people were becoming wealthy off slavery and off rice production specifically. South Carolina would also become known for cotton, but rice was the thing that first projected it as a major money-making colony.
So Heather, to recap, rice cultivation began in South Carolina by accident. Is that
right.
fair to say?
Well, began intentionally by enslaved people. They were planting rice because they knew what to do with it. They knew they could. Right. So it began intentionally. The accidental part is that the owners see it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
So it was here you have rice cultivation undertaken by the slaves for their own benefit, leading on to a huge industry that is dominated by the white folks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
good.
Prolong slavery and expand slavery.
Right.
Right. So now we're moving to music, Christianity, spirituals, and talking again just briefly about their influence. You'll notice that I teach African American history. My emphasis is on, I always center African Americans, and so there are many ways in which we could do the seminar, but the way I come at it is to look at African American practices and how they were influencing other people. But the influences, of course, go back and forth, and this is an example of that. So with religion, just want to say that in most parts of Africa, before the slave trade and during much of the slave trade, people practiced animism. They had their own spiritual practices. Some people practiced Islam. Once the Europeans started trading, then you get people on the coast, for instance, who became Christians and started attending Christian churches. But for the most part, that would not have been the case. Here, I think for historians of the 18th century and 17th century, and who focus on religion, have talked about the fact that for a long time, Africans just resisted adopting Christianity for a number of reasons. It was different from what they had practiced, and you see, it happens differently, for instance, in the Latin American countries, because where Christianity is Catholicism, some of it made more sense to Africans. And they were able to adopt it, but also to blend their own practices with it. But when you've got Anglicans, for instance, in Virginia, many enslaved people were not attracted to the religion. They did not want to have to do the catechism. They did not, most of them at that point did not read English. And so somebody else had to tell them what was going on. When you see a big shift where many Africans and African Americans began to accept Christianity during the Great Awakening, when during the development of Methodism and evangelical Christianity, where people could have a more emotional response to worship, a more emotional practice of worship, where you didn't have to go and sit on a bench week after week after week and memorize something that you would then recite back to a priest, where it could be more spontaneous and you could have a direct connection to God. That's when you see more people, more Africans and more African Americans participating and adopting Christianity. And so they were adopting it and they were adapting it. And one of the very significant things that they did, some people say, how could they have taken this religion of the master, of the oppressor, etc. And one of the things that they did was to interpret it in a way so that the Bible spoke to them and about them and spoke in their favor. And for instance, they looked at the book of Exodus, and they then identified with the Israelites as oppressed people and thought that God was going to send somebody to get them out of bondage, that was not what they were supposed to, this was not what their life was supposed to be, and that God was going to send somebody to help them to get out. There are many ways in which people attended church. So there was this Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which people came from England. There were missionaries basically trying to get planters, many in Virginia, for instance, not really interested in religion themselves, trying to get them to hold church services for enslaved people. But again, that was an Anglican organization, and many African Americans and Africans were not buying into it. But then you start seeing churches on some of the plantations, and often owners wanted to have a service where a white person had to be present. And if you go through the legislation in this time period, 1700s into the 1800s, you see lots and lots of statutes across these slave states that are trying to surveillance is at the heart of it. There should always be a white person present. If there are 10 black people, there should be at least one white person. If there's going to be a church service, there has to be a white preacher or a black preacher whom the owner has chosen, and then a white person has to be present, so that you've got to hear what the people are hearing and what they're saying and how they're responding. So surveillance was a major, major part of the law. As early as the 1660s, Virginia enacted a law that said becoming a Christian does not mean that you become free. Some black people had heard that Europeans had been enslaving each other for many centuries, but had stopped doing that, believing that you do not enslave your brother in Christ. And they thought that becoming Christians would help them to escape slavery, but the legislatures in many colonies said, no, you can become owners, you can go ahead and you can have them convert to Christianity, but that's not going to mean that they become free. So there are these churches being held, services being held by owners, and in many cases, enslaved people were allowed to go to those. But you see black people going off into the woods, into these brush harbors, secret churches, where they would have their services and they would preach to each other and preach the messages that they wanted to preach, but also preach in the style that they wanted to, and worship in the style that they wanted. Music carried the spirituals. They create these spirituals, but they also, so you've got, we talked about syncretism at the beginning. You've got Christianity being taken and shaped in a different form, but not so that it's unrecognizable, really just so that it's emphasizing something different. It's giving out a different message. Owners have their ministers saying, the main thing you want is to teach them, servants, obey your masters, and don't steal your master's property. The black people are saying, our main message is, we're going to get out of this thing. This is not what God intends for us. This is a short time, and then we're going to be out of this. And there's a way out. So you have these secret churches, and the spirituals, the music comes out of the text of the scriptures, and they really carry people's hopes and dreams about becoming free. They also use some of the hymns that white Christians had, so that they're on these plantations, they're hearing each other, and that's kind of the big point of this section of the evening, is that they're hearing each other and they're shaping their own practices. So whites are taking from blacks and blacks are taking from whites, and they're being exposed to each other.
Heather, there's a question talking about hearing each other. There's a question in the chat. Is there any evidence that slaves listened to Great Awakening speakers, or was it just that they adapted what they heard from their owners about it? Oh,
yeah, there's evidence that some of them did listen. That, you know, at the heart of it, when Whitfield and others are going around preaching, you have testimonies of people who left their work and went off, just as whites did, went off to hear him. And then Whitfield also has, there's a part of his, I guess it's a diary, where he talks about meeting with the slaves in, I want to say South Carolina, but I don't remember off the top of my head, where he met with them, he preached to them in their Sunday school. They took up an offering of their pennies and gave to him. So we definitely have evidence that some of them heard directly from these Great Awakening ministers, but also that over time, people are passing on these messages, and the shape of worship changed. And some of these black people, some of these enslaved people became, oh gosh, what's the word? They went around, evangelists, they're going around, they're preaching to other slaves, they're preaching to white people, which of course was one of the issues with the Great Awakening, is that it's gonna break down some barriers. At least some people are going to use it to break down barriers, so that women are going around, white women, black women, they have been touched by God. Because if you say that God can speak to me directly, who's to say God can't speak to a woman or to a slave? And so, yeah, there is evidence of direct, having heard some of this directly.
Yeah, I think in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, when he describes Whitfield preaching, I think he notes that there were slaves in the crowd.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember Benjamin Franklin was trying to see how far away he could stand and still hear him, right? Yeah.
He was impressed that he could stand pretty far away, and Whitfield could project that far.
Right. Yeah. I have here a quote from Frederick Douglass about the spirituals and the meaning of the spirituals. And one of the sentences that stands out to me is this: every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. They told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. There were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. And of course, one of my questions there is, he says in this next quote, that slaves sing most when they were unhappy. And my question, do you imagine that enslaved people were ever happy? And I'll just say that one of the things that I try to tell my students is that we have to try to imagine these people as fully as possible, right? So that there are moments where somebody's going to be happy. You're in a relationship, you love someone, your child is born, maybe you're just feeling good today. And then there are other times when you're overwhelmed by the work that you have to do, by the fact that you cannot come and go as you please, that you are being forced to marry somebody, that the person you love as your husband or as your wife is being sold away. So that they're full-blown people, full-blown human beings, just like all of us. And some people would have sung when they were happy because sometimes they were happy, and others would have sung when they were sad, or this book that I'm just finishing, I want to say that I've finished, is about separation of families. And you see, I've seen in several slave narratives where people talk about a coffle, a large group of people being marched from Virginia, let's say, to eventually ending up maybe in Alabama or Natchez or something like that. And as they're leaving this area, the people who know them come. So family members gather on the road because they hear that this is happening, the slave traders moving through. And then people come out of the fields and they gather, and then they start to sing, and they give you the lyrics for the songs. And it's about meeting in heaven after this. There'll be a heaven after this. There's another place where we'll meet, that kind of thing. And what struck me was that these separations were frequent enough that people even had music that went along with that. In his book, Soul by Soul, Johnson talks about community forming on these coffles, that as people who may not even know each other are being marched along, they're singing and they know some of the songs in common, and there's a kind of bonding that might begin to happen on those coffles. So music, I think, played a big role in people's lives. Here's an example, and I hope you get a chance to look at some of the sites, the links that are on the page, because I've given you links to some of this music being performed or dance being performed. And again, often it's bootleg stuff and it's not the best quality, but it gives a sense of it. I'll say more about that later. So this is Wade in the Water. If you've seen Alvin Ailey perform, this is one of the songs that when they do Revelation, this is one of the songs. And it talks about the leader looks like the Israelite, gods are going to trouble the water, see that band all dressed in red, looks like the band that Moses led. So here again, they're crossing Jordan stream. So these references to the Old Testament coming through in the music. Here I have a link to the Alvin Ailey dancers, and if you ever get a chance to see them, I really encourage it. I saw them again last year. I've been seeing them for a long time, and it was the 50th anniversary of the formation of this dance troupe that Alvin Ailey, an African-American man, founded. And they did a little film about Ailey that unfortunately they don't do all the time, but it talked about him being from Texas and having grown up in the black church in Texas, and then adapting some of that music that he had experienced in church to these performances. And so there's a question from the forum about what continues, what strands are there, and I think that these cultural practices, you can't trace them directly. I think it's very hard to trace almost anything directly from slavery because a lot of years and a lot of social and political and other events have occurred that intervene. But I think you can see with Ailey that he's taking something that was formed by slaves, these songs that had meaning to them, and they've traveled through time, and then he's putting them on stage. Now, it's really important to know that most of the people who sang these songs in the first place would have probably thought it was sacrilege to be on a stage performing like that. Right? So when the Fifth Jubilee singers started performing on stage, they were all former slaves, struggled with the idea of performing this music, because this was sacred music to them. And now they're going to these concert halls in Europe and performing for people, and that's not what was intended. So it's not a direct line, but it certainly comes out. So I encourage you to watch that, and to also go see them if they're ever in your area. Now I'm moving to Mary Boykin Chestnut's diary. So we've seen how Christianity influenced Africans and African Americans, how they took it and shaped it. And again, you could do a whole semester on anything that I'm talking about, but just to move through it. And then I wanted to show some, here's Mary Boykin Chestnut, the wife of a wealthy planter in South Carolina, and she's writing in her journal. And you get a sense of how she thinks about Black people. She's going to this praise house, going to a service, a Negro church on the plantation, and talking about how people spoke, what kinds of sermons they delivered. But what I wanted to focus on was, she said, I could not remember any of my many sins that were worthy of an eternity in torment, but if all the world's misery, sin, and suffering came from so small a sin as eating that apple, what mighty proportions mine take. And then she says, she talked about her reaction to this man, Jim Nelson, who was a driver. So a driver is somebody who's going to oversee. Basically, you have maybe a white overseer, and then you have a Black driver who makes sure that people are doing their work. He became wildly excited on his knees, facing us with his eyes shut. He clapped his hands at the end of every sentence. And she says, I wept bitterly. And then she says, you know, it was all emotional pathos. He wasn't saying anything. His words didn't make any sense, she says, but it had this strong effect on me emotionally. She says it was a little too exciting for me. I would very much have liked to shout too. So you see that people, I was just reading something from Fanny Kemble's diary. She was in Georgia. She was an English actress, moved here, married a Georgia planter, and eventually left, said, I can't do this. I can't be a slave mistress. But she was talking about going to a Black funeral. She and her husband are the only white people there, and she's talking about how they worship and how different their worship was. So that, you know, when we talk about the melting pot, it's important to know that people are taking pieces from each other, but that they're creating their own thing. If we had talked about family, for instance, Herbert Gutman spent a lot of time in his book on the family in slavery, talking about how it used to be believed, some historians used to believe, that Black people only did what white people did, that they only copied them. They were almost blank slates. And then when he looked at the plantations, he could see practices that were very, very different, how they named their children, that they wouldn't marry their cousins as their owners would, that kind of thing. That there are these practices, they had last names the owners didn't even know they had. They're not official, but they had last names. So here I'm trying to show that people were interacting with each other. Here's Laura Town. Now this happened during the Civil War. Laura Town was a woman who moved from Philadelphia. She wasn't a doctor exactly, but she worked in medicine, and she moved to St. Helena, one of the South Carolina Sea Islands, and eventually set up a school, which is now the Penn Center, but it was the Penn School. And she got there, and she's talking about, again, going to this praise house. There were these little houses built on plantations, and if you ever visit one, I went to one on St. Helena with 15 students, and I think maybe 3 or 4 other people could have fit into that space. It's a small space, but it was a place where people could go. It's away from the big house. And so you've got these different spaces in which people worshiped. You have the praise house, you've got the brush harbors out in the woods where they would go to hide from owners. They didn't want owners to know that they were having their own worship services. And then you've got services on the plantation in the open where the owners are in charge of what's fed there. And then some people accompanied owners to the owners' churches. So if you go to Edenton, North Carolina, for instance, you can see this church, and then the Black people would be up in the balcony, for instance. So here, Lauratown is having a similar experience. She's looking at the people and how they worship, and she's becoming moved by it, and in a way wants to participate, but of course that would not be appropriate for the white people to do. And they talk about, these we few white people over in the corner watching. And then finally, this is Charlotte Fortin, who was a Black woman from Philadelphia, wealthy family, had been free for generations, and she went to the Sea Islands, to St. Helena as well, to teach during the Civil War. And she goes to they like to go and observe the people. And it's great for me as a historian, because these are some of the people who provide the sources that we can then look to, people who have recorded this, people who have recorded the lyrics of the songs that they heard, because when the men were rowing the boats to take them to the islands, they hear this music. And Higginson, who was a colonel in one of the Black regiments in South Carolina, actually sat and wrote down the lyrics to these songs and some of the music. So that's how they get passed down to us in writing. People were passing them down through their families and their churches. So Fortin, very much Black upper class, a rare commodity in this time period. And she's talking about, she and Lizzie, who is a white woman, Lizzie and I in the dark corner of the house amused ourselves with practicing a little. So they're practicing some of the shouts. And one of the links that I've given you is to people doing a ring shout. And it is wonderful, that perfect time that people keep with hands, feet, and indeed with every part of the body. I enjoy these shouts very much. So you see people, outsiders, looking in and wanting to participate, and maybe also participating. So this is the link then to the ring shout.
Heather, we have a question in the chat.
Uh-huh.
How would an upper-class Black woman be defined compared to an upper-class white woman? What similarities and differences would they display?
Charlotte Fortin is interesting because she wrote a journal, and my students don't like it because they have no space in their brains to imagine a Black woman speaking the way she speaks in the 19th century. It just doesn't make sense to them, and they don't like her, and they don't know why I make them read it. But she grew up in Philadelphia, went to first an integrated school, and then was going to be moved to a segregated school. I guess after a certain age, the schools were segregated, and her parents said, no, our child's not doing that. So they sent her to Massachusetts to go to a normal school where she would be trained to become a teacher. And there she lived with a Black abolitionist family. She went to lots of abolitionist lectures, and rubbed elbows with the poets and the speakers and that kind of thing. But interestingly, in her journal, she wrote about her encounters with discrimination. So even of her class, her grandfather had become wealthy. I think he'd be the equivalent of a millionaire or something. He had built these designed sails for ships, and he had become very wealthy, and so she was very well off. But she would go to the ice cream parlor, and they would refuse to serve her. And this was in Massachusetts. So even though she was in Massachusetts attending an integrated school, there were times when she could not enter, where she was barred and denied service. And she talks about, she doesn't have many incidents like that, but there are two or three that she talks about, and she says, you know, in this great nation of ours, and even in this great state, the great state of Massachusetts, and this still happens. She also, and she thought, encountered discrimination when she applied to become a teacher. So there are these missionary organizations that were sending teachers to the South. Military people came south first, and then government officials came, because one of the main things they wanted to do was to keep the plantations running. Slavery's going to be over, but we've got to keep these Black people working, because this cotton, there's a lot of tax, a lot of federal taxation of cotton. And so they send these administrators to come and make sure people work. And they also sent ministers. And the Black people said to the ministers, we don't need ministers. We've got preachers. We want teachers. Those of us who've learned how to read during slavery and write have been teaching the others, but the children are learning very quickly. We need teachers. And so these missionary associations in the North started sending teachers. And Charlotte Fortin was in Massachusetts. She was a trained teacher. She applied, and the organization said, no, we're not sending anybody right now. And she took that to mean that they weren't going to send a Black woman. And so she left Massachusetts and went to Philadelphia, and where, of course, her family had lots of contacts. And one of the organizations there sent her. You can see in her journal that she feels very different from the enslaved people or former slaves now, early in the war on the Sea Islands, that she feels she speaks differently from them. She has had formal education. They have not. They have been slaves. They've been used to serving white people. And there's something in one of her journals, just a very small entry, that lets you think that one of the Black women who was a cook in the house where she was living didn't feel comfortable serving her, because that had never been the case before, you know, that only white people were served in that way. And so she was in this odd situation.
Well, if Fortin was a teacher, would a white woman who was also a teacher be sort of the same class, or was Fortin lifted out of sort of the middle class by virtue of her family as well?
I think class, I don't think that anybody would have made a big distinction between her and another teacher, say when she was on St. Helena, because they didn't know how much money her family had, but they knew what kind of clothing she wore, which would have been similar to a white woman from Philadelphia who was a school teacher who might not be wealthy. So I think class would more be the way you speak, the way you dress, the fact that you've traveled, not so much what's in your bank account. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, not that much unlike when we think about, you know, I think about students starting college, and in a way, almost whatever your background, you then become this other class, you know, because you've got now new access and potential and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think, but always race was going to be potentially an issue for her. But you can see her on the Sea Islands really interacting with the other white people on the island. There weren't that many of them, not the other white people, but the white people who had come from the North, because the white people from the islands had primarily fled once the Union moved in. So these teachers, for instance, were living in homes that had been abandoned by the former slave owners. So they're living in this little world. She's the only Black person from the North, and then there are all these other teachers, the superintendent of a particular plantation, and then some of the soldiers. So one of the soldiers, a white soldier from the Massachusetts 54th, was there for a while, and she interacts with them. And I don't detect race really being an issue, not something that she was expressing as being sensitive to it. She had been very sensitive in Massachusetts. So,
okay. Well, we've got about 15 minutes out, so we should probably move ahead.
Okay, so language, important thing here, many different languages spoken by Africans. And so you can imagine, Equiano talks about being able to understand many of the people. When he was passing through different hands on his way to the coast, he could understand many of the people. Maybe some things were different, but some were similar. So there are going to be some similarities, but there are going to be lots of different dialects and variations. And then they get to the Americas, and even if you just look at what became the United States, some of them are learning Dutch. Some of them learned English, Spanish. I didn't talk about Estevanico, but he was one along with the Spanish explorers in La Florida in the early 1500s. He knew Spanish, and he learned lots of Indian languages and became a broker and interpreter as they went into different Indian villages. So you get people put on a ship, brought to a new land, and they are on the ship and they may speak. Some of them may be able to understand each other, but some could not understand each other, so they had to come up with ways of speaking so that they could communicate. And then they're also being exposed to these other languages. I forgot the French in Louisiana. So people are learning lots of different languages, and that's one of the things when doing this history, I think sound is the thing that I miss the most, because of course we can read the documents, but the sounds are what I miss, especially language. And I think that it's always important to remember that people would have been speaking, people from Barbados, if you go to South Carolina today, you can still hear people who sound as though they've just come from Barbados, and they sound very different. Barbadians have a very distinctive accent, and they sound very different than from Jamaicans, for instance. And so you would have had people talking different languages, but with different accents. You've got what Ira Berlin calls Atlantic Creoles, who, when they got to America, had already passed through Portuguese hands, had Portuguese names, maybe were speaking some Portuguese, or through Spanish hands. And so you've got just this mixture of people. And you get the development of this language, Gullah, and people have been writing about it. I think it's pretty complex, and I find linguistics and the study of language kind of like math. I think it's hard to understand. But the big idea is that people were trying to find ways to communicate with each other, but also that they were bringing some of the practices from their original languages. And what they've done now, researchers have gone to Sierra Leone. Remember, Sierra Leone, one of the places that constituted the rice coast or the grain coast, lots of people came from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. And the Gullah people, I think Gullah country really technically spreads from North Carolina down to Florida, but kind of the heart of it is South Carolina, Georgia, along the coast most. And so when they went to Sierra Leone, people started to notice that the language of that they use in Sierra Leone, Creole, was very similar to Gullah, that there are lots of expressions in common. When I hear Gullah, I also recognize lots of expressions in common with Jamaican patois, for instance. And so different ways, instead of saying you all, you say uno or una. And so this language gets structured that you can imagine would have been difficult for many Europeans to understand, but then also you get Europeans or Americans by then adopting some of that language. And so this next slide talks about the children of planters brought up on the plantations and allowed to run in the woods with the little Negroes acquired the same dialect, and today many a gentleman's son regrets that it is apparent in his speech. That you've got people together, you've got Black children and white children playing together. Many of the slave narratives talk about that while they were young children, they played in the yard with the owner's children. And then they start, when they get to be about 8 or 9, they start to become aware of the fact that they were slaves. And then they start to realize what being a slave means. It means you're going to have to go to work, even as young as 8, but also that you can be sold and separated from your families. But they start out playing together. They're talking together. So they're going to influence each other. And, you know, it'd be very, very hard, I think, to trace exactly what, I think people have done this to talk about words that come out of Gullah or out of African languages that show up in English. People have done that, and there's a whole list of them. But that they're words that were commonly used and expressions that come from that exchange, that interaction. So that one was a link to some people speaking Gullah. I can't go back somehow. There it is. So this is a link where you have somebody recording a conversation, and if you try to just pick up some of what they're saying, it's really, really hard. And they're trying, I think in South Carolina especially, but also parts of Georgia, they're really trying to preserve the language. And it's interesting because I saw a young woman, a recording of a young woman who was in college just a few years ago, saying that when she was in school, not college, but in high school, elementary school, she got teased in school because she spoke Gullah at home. And then when she went to school, she couldn't speak that way, and she had to learn how to speak standard English. So that in some families, in some communities, it's still very much alive. In others, they're really trying to preserve it, because with integration of schools, but also lots of young people leaving the islands because they're small, and for economic reasons, for social reasons, they want to go away. And once you leave, it's hard to be in Chicago and maintain that dialect or that language, because the linguists now say that it's a language, it's not just a dialect.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. Let me ask if we have any questions or comments before we wrap things up. Here's your chance to get in some final questions or comments. Anything you'd like to put to Professor Williams? Okay, anything? I see we got some posters. People got some posters. Well, let me remind you that you can order that poster. Go to that America in Class website. You'll see that logo that we have there at the center of the page. Click on that, and you will get your poster. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to use the forum to continue the discussion and to share fresh approaches and questions that work. We'll monitor the forum until February 3rd. We'll pass questions and comments on to Professor Williams, and we'll get back to you on the forum. So please submit your evaluations. Don't forget to do that. Let me again urge you to get a poster. I want to thank Heather for giving us an excellent seminar this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for your participation. Let me remind you that the next Osceola seminar will be on March 13th. We will look at the religious roots of the abolition movement. That will be led by Laurie Mapley-Kipp, who is a fellow of the National Humanities Center and who teaches religion at the University of North Carolina. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Looking forward to seeing you again or hearing from you again on March 13th. To escape the classroom, go up to the upper left-hand corner of your screen, click on File. There'll be a drop-down menu. The last item is Leave the Session. Click on that, and you're home free. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Looking forward to seeing you, talking with you again soon.